Hey friends, welcome back to my channel. I'm a first year Cambridge student and I'll be going through the exam technique I developed in doing A-levels for 2 years and having sat my exams 9 months ago in maths, further maths, physics and chemistry. I hope you get some ideas about how you can improve your own exam technique, as this can often make the difference between a B and an A or an A and an A star. And of course, you won't find all of this advice useful. You don't have to follow everything I did. I just hope you can get some ideas and develop your own exam technique. As always, there will be timestamps in the description below. So my first point will be about reading the question. And I know people say read the question, read it 3, 4, 100 times before you answer it. But of course, you can still fall into the habit of only reading the question once and then just writing down an answer and moving on. And I always put it in the perspective that I should read the question at least twice before answering it, because while it can be a bit of pain to have to read the question again, even though you think you already know what it's asking you, you'll be much more likely to answer what it is actually asking if you read the question, and it can definitely make the difference of a few marks if you're completely sure that you haven't misread the question. But of course, that doesn't mean that you should spend the whole exam reading one question over and over, because that's not going to help anyone. Also, during my mock exams, when I had finished the paper and I went back to read over my answers, I noticed myself just sort of passively reading my answers rather than actively looking for mistakes. So I thought that if I read the question properly the first time around, it'd be much better, because I'd be much more likely to get it right and even make corrections then and there, than actually reading it maybe half an hour, or an hour and a half later after finishing the paper. And I also found that putting your pen or finger and moving it across the page as you read the question can be quite helpful in making sure you're actually taking in the information from the question. I wouldn't underline, because I would just find myself underlining everything. And after answering the question, I would also reread the question and make sure I had actually answered what is required. Sometimes I found it useful to tick off some of the command words, like describe, explain and whatnot, as I had done those things within the question. And especially for the long form questions in physics and chemistry, which is subjects I did, it can be helpful to go back to earlier in the question for the long questions when you want to keep track of what's happening throughout the question, because a bit of information in part A may be useful for part D, but you read that bit of information maybe 10 minutes ago. So it is worth going back to early parts in the question and making sure you're keeping track of what exactly is happening in this question. So my next bit of advice is to do with thinking before you write. It can be useful to think for a few seconds rather than writing the very first thing that comes to mind, because I found that if I thought about a question for a few more seconds, then I would save myself a lot of time in the future, because when I wrote the first thing that came to mind after reading a question, I would sort of dig myself into some kind of hole or one line of thoughts which I couldn't get out of. And only when I looked at the mark scheme, I was like, well, if I thought about this question for a few more seconds, or even, 30 seconds or so, I would have been able to figure this out. But of course, if you have no idea how to do a question within 30, 60, or however many seconds you decide, I often left a star next to the question, and I would move on and then come back to it later on, because my aim at the beginning of each exam would be to gain the most amount of marks I can do in the least amount of time. And of course, this will vary from person to person. And with that also comes understanding when to move on. You shouldn't do it too soon, otherwise you may not see the solution that presents itself. And ultimately, I decided that if I kept finding new approaches on how to do a question, then I'd carry on until I found something that worked. And if not, and I was using the same thing over and over without many results, and then I'd come back to it later if I had time. And of course, this will vary from person to person too, but you will get a feel of what to do by doing more and more questions and more past papers. So my next bit of advice is to do with being specific. Often I would find myself not being specific enough when it came to doing some exam questions. So like for chemistry, if I mentioned that electrons were lost from an atom, then I didn't write down how many were lost, even though it would be quite easy to work out. If I was comparing bond strength and I knew that X had stronger bonds than Y, I found myself just writing that X and Y have different bond strengths rather than making a comparative statement. And if a product was formed and I knew that product happened to be a white precipitate, then I wouldn't write that down. Basically, I went from not including as much detail to including more detail in my answers, and that came through making a habit and doing more and more exam questions, and remembering that this extra detail takes almost no time to include, and it may well be a marking point, and the examiner will see this detail and see that you clearly know your stuff and won't be hesitant to give you a mark, especially for the longer form questions. Ultimately, I found that as long as I explained my reasoning well and included enough detail, then I would be hitting the marking points. So my fourth bit of advice is to do with checking your answers. I would always check my answers at the end of each question to make sure I had actually answered the question, and for questions I wasn't too sure on or felt I could have included some more detail, or I just wanted to check back later on in case a new idea came to mind, I would put a little star next to it, and then after finishing the paper, I would come back to the starred questions first and see what I could do about it. And after doing all those starred questions, if I found myself still having time, then I would go back and check the other questions. So I sort of had like a priority of which questions to check first. And when checking the questions, I also found it helpful to kind of reread your answer under your breath, just to make sure it actually sounds all right. Because in one particular mock question, I found myself writing proton rather than photon, and I lost a mark because of that. And of course, you don't want to be doing that. And if I actually read through my answer under my breath rather than skimming over it, then I would notice that I have written proton instead of photon. But just make sure the examiners don't think you're talking to someone else or something. And I also found it useful to check off parts of the question as I completed it. So if, especially the command words, if the question said describe and I had described it, then I would check that off. If it said explain and I explained it, then I'd check that off as well, just to make sure that I was properly reading the question and making sure I had answered it. So my next bit of advice is to do with worrying less. It can be helpful, I found, to treat exams as more of a challenge which you're looking forward to, and telling yourself any nervous feelings you have are feelings of excitement, even though it sounds a bit strange, but it does help reframing the exams just before you go in, because you don't want to get into a kind of panic frenzy before the exam, because not panicking is a crucial part of doing the exam. If you panic and you go crazy jumping from one question to another question and all sorts of like that, then next thing you know, the exam's already over and you've only answered about half of the questions or something. I found myself doing that a few times, but I found it useful to sort of reframe exams, often to even stay focused or to calm down if you found yourself getting too nervous or panicking. I would practice smooth and rhythmic breathing, because I've heard that it allows for a regular heart rate and regular blood flow to the brain and whatnot. And it was all about rhythm, so it doesn't matter if you did 4 seconds in, 6 seconds out, 5 seconds in, 5 seconds out, or any other numbers. It's just about having like a rhythmic blood flow or something. I don't know, I haven't really done biology for a while, but it's all about the rhythm and like smooth breathing. And that may well be useful in your case if you find yourself struggling to stay focused or calming down during an exam. So my next bit of advice is to do with letting your mind wander around a bit, especially when you're doing a harder question, because if you become so fixated on one solution that you can see no other solution, even though you know there is one, it's useful to relax a bit and sort of let your mind wander around if you do have the time to do so. And use this thing called diffuse thinking. In case you don't know what that is, I would suggest Googling it or searching on YouTube. Maybe look around the room for a bit, let your mind wander, and just generally take a maybe 30-second, 1 minute break. And next thing you know, you look back at the question and you realize you find your mistake in the answer which you've written, or you even realize that this is what I need to be doing with this question, and it's quite useful for the harder questions, helping you figure them out. So then my final few bits of advice is having more confidence in some of the answers, because I got to a stage where I spent too much time checking my answers and maybe rereading the same answer many, many times, and just generally wasting my time because of that. It's good to have a bit of confidence in the answers so you can just sort of focus more on which questions are important rather than spending ages rereading over the same answers a few times. As well as that, I would suggest sleeping well beforehand, getting a good sleeping routine during exam time rather than staying up late at night cramming. So I used to always go to bed about 10 p.m, 10:30 and wake up at about 6:37 in the morning. But of course, you know what's best for you. And I also bought a small, cheap watch, which I would have on the table of my exam. And I would set a timer on it so I could see exactly how much time was left rather than like looking around the hall and seeing wherever the clocks are left. But of course, it depends on your exam hall and whatnot. But it's good to just have something in the corner of your eye just so you can keep track of the time. But of course, don't look at it too frequently, otherwise you will find yourself panicking. So that's all the advice I have, and that was basically my exam technique, which helped me get 4 A stars. Thanks for watching. Leave a like, comment, and subscribe if you found this video useful. Leave a comment if you have any other video recommendations. And I'll see you in the next one.